Out in the depth, Simon and his friends find an overflowing catch of fish. What the fishermen pull up from the depths, it's a gift. A catch so large it almost burst the nets and sank the boat. We know this was from Jesus because this is the way it is with Jesus.
That's the Reverend Dr. Claudia Kohli-Reichenbach. And today, she brings you a powerful message entitled Into the Deep. I'm Katie Givens-Keim. Welcome to episode number 4168 of Day One. Welcome to Day One, the weekly program that brings you outstanding preachers from America's historic Protestant churches, sharing insight and inspiration from God's Word for your life. Hello, friends. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Katie Givens-Keim, and today on Day One, we take a trip to Bern, the capital of Switzerland, to welcome the Reverend Dr. Claudia Kohli-Reichenbach, theologian, pastor, and preacher in the Swiss Reformed Church. Besides preaching in her congregation in Bern, Claudia is the co-founder of L'École de Silence, which teaches contemporary spiritual formation in secular settings. And she teaches courses on spirituality and spiritual care at the Faculty of Medicine in Bern. Claudia holds advanced degrees in theology and spirituality from the University of Bern, Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and the University of Zurich. Claudia, welcome to Day One. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Tell us a little bit about where on planet Earth you and your ministry are located.
Okay, I'm located in Bern. That's the capital of Switzerland. In Switzerland, we do have IKEA, but it's not the same as Sweden. So Switzerland is in the middle of Europe, and it's like we have France and Germany and, Liechtenstein and Italy around us. It's a small country.
Got it. Fantastic. And tell us about your congregation where you find yourself in the pulpit preaching.
I'm serving for the Swiss Reformed Church, and it's influenced very much by Zwingli and Calvin, but in our name we don't have Zwingli and Calvin because I would say we don't really care that much about confessionalism.
Got it. See, that I would not expect that. I would think, Swiss Reformed Church, like the Church of Switzerland, Zwingli and Calvin, they were part of your lineage, but not a major part, sounds like.
They are, but we don't really go. I mean, of course, we do go back to them very strongly, but they are not the
main, focal saints.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Like the Luther Church, they much more have it in the name, of course.
Well, your ministry, Claudia, also extends beyond the Church of Switzerland and beyond one congregation. You also have a couple of pretty unusual ministries. One, you provide spiritual care in emergency situations. That's one of the places where you're credentialed. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the state in Switzerland, they have care teams, and we're working when there is an emergency. And so we go out to the field and care for people there. And it's basically in a very secular context. But I do my ministry there as well. That's one part. And the other part is for teaching at university, and especially at the medical faculty. So that's another quite secular context again.
Yes, and that's where you and I got to know each other several years ago at the University of Bern, when we both taught there. And you also have yet another ministry. Tell us about, it's translated the School of Silence, is that right?
Yeah, the École de Silence, we founded it a year ago, and it's basically to foster spirituality in a post-secular context. And the idea was, we realized that so many people in Switzerland are not part of the church anymore. They wouldn't see themselves as Reformed Christians or whatever. But they definitely have a longing and questions and answers to spirituality. And so we said, let's go over the threshold of the church and go into their places and offer formation in spirituality It's an adventure.
I bet. Well, that provides a lot of context for just discovering the way God is showing up for people in settings outside of church. Is there any particular moment lately, either in the School of Silence ministry context or perhaps even in emergency vehicles providing spiritual care? Is there any sort of moment or story that stands out that really makes clear to you, this is why I do this?
Yes. There was this drug addicted person, and he was in the emergency was there in the hospital, and he was in coma. And the family asked me to come and to be with them as a care team person. And I asked them, can I bless him? And they said, no, he wasn't religious. And they said, we're not religious at all. But then I said, it's just an offer. And 2 hours later, they called me again, and I blessed the person. And that was a very deep moment, I think also for them. That's what they mentioned. And because it's not anything I have. I do live out of the blessing, but I don't have it. And that for me, that was a good moment.
Yeah. It also says a lot about translating across borders. And I will say, one of my favorite things about Switzerland that just astounds me, that I think that I didn't know before, was just that Switzerland is a place with 4 languages that are official. Do you want to just say a quick bit about that?
We do have German, but it's a foreign language in a way as well, because we have a strong dialect.
Right.
So we have
Schweizerdeutsch. Yes, Swiss German.
Yeah. We have German, French, Italian, and Romansch. It's a small part in Switzerland, but it's an official language. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then so many people educated in Switzerland also learn English also. So it's, to me, it's just astounding thinking about how to live as one small country with so many official languages that are recognized. How does that work?
Well, it's a good way to learn diversity within a small place. And of course, in Switzerland, as it is so small, you know each other, or at least you know people who know other people. And so to learn, I think it's a good place to learn how to live with diversity.
So in your experience, Claudia, you've worked in spiritual care across religious traditions and in healthcare. How do you think faith communities today across borders can better equip themselves to provide care for people who need it in moments of crisis?
For me, the most important is to really go back to your own resources in your tradition. In Bern, we have this interesting place called the House of Religions, where 8 religions, they live together. And I learned a lot, for example, from Sasi. He is the Hindu priest there. And he is doing a lot of care in hospital and so on. And he, of course, he draws from the resources he has in his faith. Because I think he's such a strong believer, like a Hindu believer. I think that's a very good starting point to give care. And I would say it's the same in our traditions, like to go deep into our tradition and live out of these resources.
Now listen for God's word as we hear from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11.
Once, while Jesus was standing beside the Lake of Galilee, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw 2 boats there on the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to burst. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were astounded at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who are partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him.
Now, Reverend Dr. Claudia Kohli-Reichenbach's sermon entitled Into the Deep.
What a story! It begins with hustle and bustle. People flock to hear Jesus teaching. They want a front row seat, jostling to hear him, pressing forward to see him. This is great cinema for our eyes, so packed with movement. Boats rowing out to sea, men sweating as they fished, nets almost breaking because they are so full, the boat almost sinking under the weight of fish. Another boat has to rush to the rescue. So much is going on in this story. Only Jesus stands still. He just stands there by the Sea of Galilee. And later, when the boats begin to move, he sits and teaches. In the hustle and bustle, there is Jesus' quiet presence. Let us shift our focus to the other characters. Let's look now at the fishermen, the ones who fished all night. They are cleaning up after an unsuccessful night. They caught nothing. And then Jesus shows up. They didn't ask him to come. The fishermen didn't do anything to attract his attention, to gain his interest. He is simply there. They don't approach him. He approaches them. He is the one who speaks to them. This story in the Gospel of Luke may remind us of another story from Gospel of John. Do you remember this story? In this story, too, the disciples are fishing and they have had an unsuccessful night. No fish caught. But suddenly, they are visited by the risen Christ. They didn't call him. They did not expect him. He was simply there, on the shore, speaking to them and speaking to us. The memory of that story in John helps us to understand better this story from Luke. Jesus is always showing up unexpectedly in our lives. There were these disciples, just doing the routine work of cleaning up their nets after the disappointments of the night. No fish, nothing to show for their work. And then, suddenly, Jesus is there. It's like that for us too. In the middle of life's humdrum, routine, and disappointments, Jesus comes unexpectedly into our lives. You know what I mean. Maybe we are frustrated after endless meetings and defeated hope that something good will finally happen. Or maybe we are frustrated after many prayers for a miracle to happen. Or maybe we're disappointed by the outcome of an election or the seemingly endless wars that ravage our earth. But then, when we least expect it, when we are just cleaning our nets after another day of disappointment, Jesus just shows up. He came to the frustrated fishermen, and he comes to us. He stepped into their lives, and he steps into mine. He spoke to them. He speaks to me. What is it like when Jesus suddenly appears in our lives? After he spoke to the fishermen, there was hope in the future. Everything somehow changed, radically changed. Now let us focus on another aspect of this story, the water. It's significant that this story takes place on the sea, on the water. Water can be beautiful and life-giving, but water is also frightening and dangerous. Water stories in the Bible often have an unpredictable dynamic. I grew up on a large lake. I loved being on the water, swimming in the water, enjoying the water. But if I ever drifted out into the deep water, things changed quickly. In the deep water, I would lose the ground under my feet, control of myself. The shallow water was safe and comfortable, but deep water is something different indeed. Did you notice in our story today that Jesus sits down with the fisherman in the swaying boat and says to Simon, "Put out into the deep water." The deep water. Don't fish in the shallows, but fish where it's deep. That makes sense in terms of basic fishing. The fish are sometimes in the deeper water. But it's also symbolic of what Jesus is doing in our lives. Jesus is sending us to the deep water, to the places where things can be frightening and dangerous, to the places where we are not always in control. This instills great respect in me. Put out into the deep water, leave the shallow water behind you. Head away from the safe shore. Go where you no longer have safe ground under your feet, where the winds whistle and the waves can be as high as a house. Put out into the deep water. It's the walk to the place where it is deep, abysmal, and sometimes very uncomfortable. Jesus goes with us. It's the walk to the place where depth awaits, deep ground, profundity, deep meaning. Put out into the deep water, so we go with the disciples into the deep water. Even if we are afraid of the depths, we are bold to go, not because we are always braves, but because Jesus goes with us. Put out into the deep water, he says, I'll go with you. Do I know where in my life the deep waters lie in wait? Put out into the deep water. This move into deep water marks the beginning of the biggest change in Simon's life. Now let us focus on another aspect of this story, the miracle that happened out there in deep water, outside, in the depths, in an uncomfortable place. The miracle happens. Out in the depths, Simon and his friends find an overflowing catch of fish. This is not just fishing luck or a tribute to their fishing skill. What the fishermen pull up from the depths, it's a gift. The gift is overwhelming and abundant. A catch so large it almost burst the nets and sank the boat. We know this was from Jesus because this is the way it is with Jesus. When Jesus was at the wedding, When the wine ran out, Jesus asked them to fill the water jugs standing around. Water became the best wine, and not a little of it. Abundance is the way it is with Jesus. And there was another time when Jesus was in the great meadow, when thousands of people were hungry towards evening, and Jesus asked what his friends had brought with them. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish fed everyone, and again it was abundant and overflowing. They could still fill baskets with leftovers. And now in our story, it happens after an unsuccessful night of fishing, a catch of abundance. That's the way it is with Jesus. Abundance. I find 2 things exciting. First, I find it exciting that in all these stories, Jesus takes something that human beings give him and turns it into the abundant gift of God. He took some water in water jugs and turned it into an abundance of wine. He took a few loaves and fish and turned it into a feast for a multitude. And here he took boats and empty nets and filled them up to overflowing. We bring who we are, what we are, and what we have. And that's where Jesus picks up. Miracles are sometimes much closer than we think. They happen with what Jesus does with what we bring. The second thing I find exciting and also somewhat overwhelming is that Jesus' miracles are always extravagant, always somehow too much, so much so that the boats almost tip over and it becomes dangerous. Too much liters of wine, too much baskets of bread. And in our story, not just a few fish, not just enough for a fish dinner, but far too many fish. It got really dangerous. It's too much of a good thing even for my enlightened mind. All the miracle stories overwhelm me, and I don't want to override or trick my rational mind. I am overwhelmed. And so was Simon. No wonder Simon shouted at Jesus, "Go away! It's too much." Simon falls to the ground in shock. Anyone who encounters God experiences fascination and shock at the same time. Rudolf Otto described this in a book, The Idea of the Holy, a good 100 years ago. He described this so aptly that many people have cited his descriptions ever since. Whoever experiences the holy, says Rudolf Otto, is confronted with a mysterium fascinans and at the same time tremendum. In other words, fascinating and deeply shocking at the same time. Because we do not understand it. Because we don't have it under control. We can't control it. Simon experiences this power. And Jesus responds to it, which is repeated many times in the Gospel, "Do not be afraid." Even if we are overwhelmed by it, to live, to play in God's overwhelming gift, to think, to enjoy, that's our happiness. Do not be afraid. Since then, abundance has been flowing out, capturing every pore of our body, every cell of our brain, and the depths of our soul. Simon was overwhelmed by abundance of the miracle, but he was also overwhelmed by something else. Jesus' miracle was not merely dazzling, it was life-changing. Because of what happened out there in the deep water, Simon had to change. Jesus puts it this way, "Don't be afraid, Simon. You'll still be a fisherman, but from now on, you won't be catching fish. You will be catching people." Fishing for people? At first I was uncomfortable with this image, letting people run into the net like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, seducing people like a dictator, disposing of people who have fallen into the net. That's religion at its worst. Surely, Jesus can't mean that. When we take one last look at what happens in this story, we see that Jesus means something quite different, quite surprising. Fishing for people is not about clever tactics or strategies, trapping people into our designs on them. No, the abundant catch of fish in our story is a gift from God, not a tribute to our fishing skills or cleverness. The fish in the net turn out to be nothing but a gift. This fishing has nothing to do with pure calculation. Rather, this kind of fishing means going into the depths and letting go. Fishing for people is experiencing other people as a gift from God. In the end, Simon and the fishermen who have been summoned drag everything ashore. Exciting and almost funny that they still do this, because afterwards they follow the word of Jesus. They clear the stage. They left everything and followed him. A few years ago, Banksy's famous painting of the girl and the balloon was sold at auction for millions of dollars. But there was a surprise. Just at the moment when the new owner took possession of the painting, a secret device hidden by the artist in the picture frame shredded the painting into pieces. One might have thought that the shredded painting was now worthless, but not so. Actually, the shredded painting was eventually auctioned, and it brought in even more millions of dollars. Just so, Simon's old life fishing for fish was shredded by Jesus' command to fish now for people. But Simon's new life, crafted out of the tatters of his old life, was worth even more. Simon and his friends cleared the set. They left everything behind and followed him. The backdrop is empty. The story of people and fish and the experience of overwhelming gift. It continues in another place. Here, for example, now, with you, with me, following him. Amen.
Our preacher today was the Reverend Dr. Claudia Kohli-Reichenbach. For a free transcript of her sermon, Into the Deep, you can visit us online at day1.org. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always a joy to be part of your Sunday. But why stop there? Make Day One part of your week by subscribing to the Day One Weekly Update e-newsletter. Every Wednesday, you'll get the latest sermon, plus resources like curated messages from our rich archive and thoughtful articles from leading theologians, all tied to the week's lectionary readings. Whether you're a preacher, educator, or anyone seeking to grow in faith, it's the perfect way to stay connected and inspired. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter at day1.org. 2025 marks 80 years of Day One sharing messages of hope and unity, bringing together Christians from all walks of life. This ministry exists because of the faithful generosity of listeners like you. As we enter the new year, we invite you to reflect on how Day One has made a difference in your life. Your investment in this ministry helps us continue sharing these meaningful messages with a world in need of hope. To support this mission, visit us online or mail your contribution to Day One, 4062 Peachtree Road Northeast, Suite A629, Atlanta, Georgia 30319. Thank you for helping us bring light and encouragement to so many. Next week on Day One, we are honored to welcome Reverend Dennis Patterson Jr., priest in charge of the Episcopal Church of the Holy Cross in Decatur, Georgia. In his sermon, The Power of Position, based on Luke 6, Reverend Patterson reflects on how Jesus meets us where we are, on level ground, and challenges us to reconsider the positions we hold in our lives. With his dynamic preaching and focus on community, Reverend Patterson invites us to discover how God's presence with us can reshape how we see ourselves and others. That's next week on Day One. Claudia, thank you so much for that sermon. I love when you speak about Jesus calling Simon Peter to put out into the deep water. I just think there's so many times in life when we are called to put out into the deep water. Are there moments in your ministry or your life, Claudia, where you've felt God calling you to take a big risk in faith, a putting out into the deep water?
I would say it's not one big step, but maybe this movement towards the secular context. I realized that staying within the church building would be, for me, would be easier, but to step out and to find language out there, to find Christ out there in a very secular world. For me, that's my movement into the depths, and I'm really still seeking and looking around.
Yeah, boy, doesn't that describe just the challenge for so many of us who identify as Christians and figuring out how to translate that outside the church, again, with the translation piece. Where have you found it to be successful when you do that? Has it, in the medical setting, for instance, like you've had to translate the language of spiritual care and faith and even Christianity in medical settings. Where has that been harder or easier for you?
You know, in a medical setting, you can't work with the big words like grace or justification or sin.
Yeah.
They wouldn't get it. I mean, in a secular context. And so I have to try to find language for that. That's on the one hand. And I think maybe my message gets simpler than it was before. I mean, there is a focus on presence. That's something I really think is so important to learn, is to be present. And it resonates for me a lot with our tradition. Katie, that's stupid what I say.
No, it's not.
It is.
So it resonates with your tradition. Just, I agree. It does. It resonates with our tradition. You know, one sort of push and pull I find myself in, maybe you too, is when we're watering it down too much and becoming the language of the therapeutic.
Right.
I tend to gravitate right there because I care more in that moment about providing good care than sometimes I do about exactly translating Christian principles and understandings of a moment.
Yeah. I can say something about that.
Yeah.
Shall I say something?
Yeah, you should.
Okay. I don't want to water it down. Of course, there is a risk of doing it, but it's more like I don't want to live with the principles, but I want to live with the presence that it's in it, you know?
Mm-hmm. So, in other words, when you were providing a blessing for the person who passed from an addiction overdose, I think you said, with the family, it wasn't important in that moment to, if they understood the major confessional pieces of Christianity, but that you would want to lead them towards that if they showed any sort of interest or hunger.
Exactly. And, I did also afterwards, I did the funeral, the person died. I did the funeral, and I didn't use a lot of religious language, but in one moment, like for me, it was so important to really believe that Christ is there in this moment. To strongly believe it myself.
Yeah.
And there was this one moment when I prayed to God and I prayed to Jesus, our peace. And I think it was this one moment that I somehow used the word so strongly, and I don't use it a lot, but in this one moment, I think there is something that happened because,
Yeah. And sometimes you walk away and you just know that the something has happened.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about abundance and how overwhelming it can be, because the overwhelming catch of fish in your sermon, that just serves as such a great metaphor for God's abundant grace. And yet it can be such a challenge sometimes in times when scarcity and overwhelming problems are so much louder than the abundance of God's grace. How do we center God's abundance better in our lives and fight that fear, the overwhelming sense of scarcity?
It's my deep conviction that abundance is lying within us also. I know that's a little bit a mystical thought, but we do have this mystic in our Reformed tradition.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
We do have them. And that's my deep conviction that abundance lies there. And it's a question of, do we perceive it?
Yep.
That's one aspect that I'm deeply convinced. For example, I would say to do some journaling, for example, and to perceive in my daily life the fullness of God. Small steps.
Small steps, they matter.
They matter, and I'm so deeply convinced that the abundance is there. And at the same time, we can't really control it, and we can't have it. I mean, that's so interesting for me in the story, that in the end there is this abundance and all the fish, but then they leave. I mean, they take them to the shore, but they don't matter again. And for me, it's a picture of, or an image of, we can't control it, and there is also absence at the same time. There is abundance and absence at the same time.
Yes, that's such a paradox with such tension in it, the abundance and the absence. Yeah.
And I would say it's a paradox that it's in our experience of God as well, very much so. Mm-hmm. Like we can perceive this abundance of God, and at the same time, we can't control God, or we don't have God. For me, that's very key.
So, back to this issue of like the boundary between secular and sacred, between church and the rest of the world. You and your family, your lovely family, you have 3 kids, and you all have had the experience of living in a religious community in Bern and then living outside a community. And how have you in your family life and in your ministry experienced that boundary of secular and church?
For me, it's key not to have that boundary too much. And I would say, for me, it's key to expect the risen Christ in the middle of the secular world. I'm very much influenced by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian who was so much looking for Christ in the secular world. And
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, yes, such an influential theologian from your part of the planet, for sure. And he wrote, what was his book that he wrote that was about living in community specifically? Like, we know him for the way he stood up in the time of Hitler, but before that, he wrote about Christians living with each other.
He did, but to be honest, it's more like the late letters that influenced my theological thinking. His way, how he looked at the world as it was at that time, and it was terrible at that time. And he never spoke so positively about the world as at the time when he was in prison and the world was so bad. And he spoke about it in such a honoring way because he knew it was God's world.
Wow.
It's a paradox. But I think because he had so strongly the eyes for this risen Christ in this world.
Yeah. And he came from that experience of deep commitment of Christians living with each other and then bringing that to the world. And going back to what you said about, sometimes it's important to ignore the boundaries and to just be looking always for how Christ is appearing to us in life. How else do you think Bonhoeffer's theology and Bonhoeffer's work speaks to us in our time today?
I think his insight into the religious-less interpretation of biblical terms, that's something that's so key at the moment. How can we talk or proclaim God's word without referring to big words that nobody understands anymore?
So plain language, not theological terms.
Somehow, yes. That's something I think that's really needed to find this language today. I think it's a big challenge, especially in the secular setting. But that's something that I think he really pointed to as an important point. And of course, the other one is how he dealt with the Bible and how much this word was a word that was transforming himself. That's something that's fascinating. Of course, that's so at the basic of our tradition that we have this biblical word that transforms us and not only informs us, but transforms us. And that's, for me, that's key how I look at the stories and how I want to preach on them. It's basically involving people into these stories so that we are transformed more and more to the image of Christ.
Yes, that reminds me of how you describe in the sermon Jesus transforming what we already have, our water jars, our loaves, our empty nets, into miraculous abundance. Claudia, is there a particular scripture passage that tends to orient you in disorienting times or comfort you in difficult times?
I would say it's the end of Mark's gospel, like Mark 16, the end when the women, they flee away because they can't have him. They can't find him. And so I think at the very beginning of the Christian story is this disappearance. He was not there anymore. And for me, it's so much about we can't control God. We can't have God. But it's interesting, they were advised to go back to Galilee. So it's basically going out again and look for him. But they don't have him. They don't have the risen Christ. And so for me, this passage is really key in how I want to live my Christian life. There is a disappearance of God. Also in our post-secular context, so much. But look for God. That's what I take out of this story.
So you hear it not only as a sort of a call to action, but I hear it now with you explaining that way as almost a comfort. Like, it's okay. No, it is really hard what you're going to go do. You don't have Jesus with you in the same way that Jesus was with us before. And yet, it's okay. You're not alone. You're doing it together. I love that too. It's not just one woman who was told. It was multiple.
Yes. And it's comfort, as Christian faith is comfort, but it's at the same time, it's totally challenging and shaking my existence. Also, when I read the Bible, I love the Bible. I teach it a lot. I love the stories, but I'm frightened as well and shaken, and it's shaking my existence. Also, the story I preached about, I'm really a little bit shaken by the part that at the end, they had to leave everything. The scene it's left empty at the end, but they follow. It's always being in movement and looking for this Christ.
And what do you think? Is it you have to just leave what is known and go into the unknown? Is that what is most?
Maybe, or for me, it's the control. I can't control God, not in my life.
Yeah. Illusion of control is so convenient. Sometimes I really like my illusions.
I like it so much, but you don't know where God shows up.
Yeah. And you always have those moments, don't you, where you realize how much illusion you were living with, like, oh, I really did think I was steering the boat.
Mm-hmm. And letting go. That's such a big thing in life, I think.
Yes. Yeah. I find that parenting is an occasion for so much letting go as well. Do you find the same?
Totally. We have 2 teenagers. Yes. Agreed.
Yes. We only have 1, but agreed. Claudia, it is such a privilege, and you have given Day One such a gift to come share the word with us and to share your ministry and your presence. Thank you for coming as a voice from Switzerland, the first on the Protestant Hour and Day One.
Wow, I feel so honored. Thank you so much, Katie.
You've been listening to Day One, the voice of America's mainline Protestant churches for, 79 years. Just one shy of 80, but who's counting? For all that time, we've been proclaiming God's hope to a hurting and divided world. Day One is produced by the Alliance for Christian Media. You can visit us anytime at day1.org. Thanks for being with us. I'm Reverend Dr. Katie Givens-Keim. May the grace of God be with you on Day One and every day yet to come.